Mr. Acting Deputy President, and I rise today to address the main reasons why the Coalition will not be supporting the National Reconstruction Fund bill in its current format. And I'm actually surprised that some opposite are going to be supporting it, because when they come in to address this bill, their bill, they're not talking about selling the bill to us. They're not talking about how great it's going to be. All they do is keep looking back towards the Coalition and talking about what the previous government did, and of course they're rewriting history significantly. But, you know, if this was so great, wouldn't you think that they'd be in here to sell their bill, to talk about the positive impacts it's going to have, rather than just using cheap political shots, which then hilariously they talk about using cheap political shots. But they are the government, and they should be in here selling the positive outcomes to Australian people on the bills that they propose. But unfortunately they can't do that, because this bill does not produce those outcomes. Firstly, the bill ignores key economic issues, and we know that that's a consistent message from those opposite. And in order for any of these things to be successful, the government must address rising energy prices, labour market shortages and disrupted supply chains if we are to have a manufacturing sector that is able to succeed. And without policies that create strong economic conditions, any and all government spending is simply in vain. It would be money in one pocket and out the other due to the cost pressures the government is just failing to address. The Coalition is opposing this bill because this arrogant government is telling our manufacturers what they think they need, rather than addressing what manufacturers actually want. Now, we know that Labor's made a desperate, dodgy deal with the Greens, their partners in crime, which will prohibit coal or gas from receiving finance from this National Reconstruction Fund at a time when energy prices are causing businesses to close. Those opposite are too busy doing deals with their Greens mate, which are going to further restrict manufacturing in this country. Because Australian manufacturers, and we on this side understand this completely, they rely on cheap energy to make things onshore. But Labor's continued demonisation of gas and broken promises to bring power prices down will force more Australian manufacturing overseas. Every expert in the country, every single one, is calling on the Prime Minister to unlock more supply of gas. More supply, meeting the demand, lowering the price. And indeed, some manufacturers have had their gas bills triple. Not double, but triple. But these backroom deals that they insist on making with the Greens undermine any effort to bring power prices down. And we know that Labor will always work with the Greens to push their own agenda rather than support the needs of Australian businesses and families. Secondly, why we'll be opposing this bill is that we know it will create even more lost time for manufacturers in this broken model, and it will take a significant time for any money to start flowing. The Clean Energy Finance Corporation, on which the NRF is modelled, was established in 2012, and the first investment was only made some 10 months later. Manufacturers in Australia cannot afford to wait that long. The government announced that the NRF should be up and running by next financial year, but haven't committed to a launch date. Should be up and running. We remember all the broken promises you made before the election, $275 off power bills. Instead, they're going the other way. 97 times Mr Albanese said that. Now no one opposite can even mention that number. Broken promises over superannuation. You said no changes to superannuation, and now we hear from Senator Gallagher really regularly that they're modest changes that are scaring farmers who may have to sell their family's property to pay a tax bill from an unrealised asset. And we know franking credits, there were going to be no changes, but now they're back on the agenda. So why should manufacturers have any faith when you talk about there should be a launch date by next financial year but won't actually outline when this will be up and running? Is this just going to be adding to the litany of already many, many, many broken promises? And industry feedback suggests that this type of funding mode takes years to get right. and that those years will be lost to Australian manufacturers and will be causing the loss of significant jobs across our country. And let's not forget that while those manufacturers are waiting, we get closer and closer to 23rd, a world where hard-to-abate industries will no longer exist in Australia. Think about all the refining resources in this country. Iron, coal, oil, they'll all be forced out. And I've certainly in this place spoken about the cement industry and the impact the safeguard mechanism is going to have on that. We know that cement industries in Australia cannot abate the creation of clinker, the most important and emissions-intensive part of the cement process. But yet those opposite are going to either send it offshore, destroying Australian jobs and Australian companies, ensuring that we have no sovereign supply of cement. And we know that all of this is just a recipe for economic disaster. And we can't blame the public servants in each individual agency. They only see the work that they're doing. They don't look at all the broader implications across different bills and the different departments. That's actually the job of the government, for them to have a look at what's being proposed across government departments and to ensure that they are always considering the cost to our citizens, the impact on industry and what unintended consequences may be. But this is a government that just proves day on day that they are not up to the challenge. The NRF has a poor funding model. The model shifts from a competitive grants program with robust processes to government acquiring equity and providing loans. When we talk about unintended consequences, absolutely know what's coming down the track. Government equity and loan schemes are less accessible than grants. Manufacturers may struggle to meet the return on investment thresholds or put together detailed business cases in-house. So what will happen to failed or failing loans? It's clear that the last experiment down this path, the Victorian Economic Development Corporation, uprooted manufacturers. Eligibility is another issue. Certain industries might have margins which are too small, or it could be too risky with disrupted supply chains. So many will no doubt miss out, and the fund could become equivalent to a white elephant. And before the election, Mr Albanese also claimed, aside from 97 times $275 reduction to power bills, he also claimed that he was putting forestry at the heart of his manufacturing policy, naming it as a priority under the National Reconstruction Fund. On 17th of May 2022, he wrote to Tasmanian forestry workers pleading for their vote. "I promise you that if I become Prime Minister," he said, "a government I lead will not shut down the native forestry industry. I will take up the fight against them," referring to the Greens, "to protect your job too." Not even a year on, the Prime Minister has broken this promise as well, via his desperate, dodgy deal with the Greens in return for support for this National Reconstruction Fund, a deal which prohibits investment in native forest logging in the so-called Reconstruction Fund. The bill also undermines investment certainty in national priorities, with the government changing Australia's national manufacturing priorities on a political whim, undermining investment decisions and eroding investor confidence. This is particularly pertinent to the space industry, complementary medicine, and also, to a lesser extent, recycling. The government's new priorities are too vague. They don't focus where the focus should be, needed to drive investment into specific sectors. And this is typical of Labor, choosing to spray money indiscriminately instead of continuing investment certainty for our manufacturers and industry. The government has displayed a callous lack of understanding for how these delays may have already damaged these projects. But one of the key pillars of this new manufacturing strategy was our strategic decision to bolster Australia's capability in the space sector. We supported funding to locally design, develop, manufacture and deploy specialised space products, equipment, systems and services for export to international markets, and to support national and international space missions. The government has chosen to effectively wipe out the Coalition's efforts to develop our space industry manufacturing by removing it as a priority area. The space industry and the Australian public are yet to understand the basis in which this shift in focus was made. The government must address the critical issues affecting our manufacturing, not tinker with a proven model. With power prices forecast to spike not go down, to spike by 56%. I say to those in the gallery, if you've already seen your power bills go up, they're about to go up a whole heap more, and you can thank those opposite for that. But also the businesses that are now going to be pushed to the brink. It's time this government delivers inflationary support for industry and put forward a plan to deal with these spiralling power prices. And finally, the fifth reason why the Coalition will not be supporting this National Reconstruction Fund in its current form is the complete fiscal irresponsibility that it is. Delivering funding well in excess of the Coalition's modern in excess of the Coalition's modern manufacturing strategy. Initial $5 billion appropriation is provided upon passage of the bill, but the timing of the remaining $10 billion will not be subject to further parliamentary approval. So $10 billion of your money, $10 billion of those sitting in the gallery and every Australian taxpayer won't be subject to any scrutiny in this place. Those opposite, the Labor government, will be able to put that money wherever they like. And we know how those slush funds work and benefit their mates in the unions, not small businesses in this country, not Australian manufacturers, and certainly not Australian families. And we know that similar financial structures to the one underpinning this bill have drawn criticism from the IMF, who stated that implementation of below-the-line activity through newly created investment vehicles, such as the NRF, should be phased appropriately, and more broadly, a proliferation of such vehicles should be avoided. The IMF is saying that it should be avoided. And this is the important part, though, other than it saying it should be avoided. The cost of living support in light of high energy prices should be targeted, aimed at protecting vulnerable households and small, viable firms. Let's not forget, though, Labor is carelessly rushing through a total of $45 billion of off-budget spending. How's that transparency going, guys? Remember that new kind of place? Well, we know that hasn't worked. We saw a disgraceful performance by one of your frontbench ministers, cabinet ministers, last week in this place. You promised more transparency, but instead you've moved to $45 billion of off-budget spending. No accountability, no oversight, no transparency. The bill hasn't passed, and already unions are licking their lips at the prospect of the NRF and have listed their demands. A third of the board positions hand-picked by the Australian Council of Trade Unions, the ACTU, that bastion of morality, not. Their positions will determine who gets access to funding. An enterprise agreement with unions is a precondition to make an application. Applicants must not have engaged in conduct that treats workers unfairly. That's a very vague term and a vague way of saying if you're not with the unions, you're against them. And demanding that applicants must commit to direct employment. So if contractors or indirect workforce is used, they must be employed on the same conditions as the direct workforce. This essentially enshrines compulsory unionism if you want to be a successful applicant. And it's for these reasons, amongst others, but for these 5 reasons primarily, the Coalition will not be supporting this bill in its current form.